Here's today's reminder. If your church is going to grow, you have to equip your leaders. But how do you do this? How do you empower the leaders at your church to lead well? Join us at equiplab.com/churchleaders. We're here to equip your ministry team to thrive. Just go to equiplab.com/churchleaders and join us today.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Jason Day, and in this series, we are exploring the church's stance on LGBTQ issues. This has been a pressing conversation for some time, and we believe it is only growing more important that believers and church leaders engage in this conversation with both love and wisdom. There are many questions that Christians are wrestling with, including what does it mean to love someone in the LGBTQ community while not compromising what the Bible says? Can someone be both gay and Christian? Should we use someone's preferred pronouns? And how can pastors best address these topics with care from the pulpit? We'll explore questions like these from multiple angles: theological, academic, cultural, and social. We'll also hear from the local pastor's perspective. Our guests are more than experts. For some of them, this conversation is extremely personal. We hope that this series will be informative and will help you navigate this challenging area of life and ministry with wisdom, with grace, and with love. And now, let me introduce you to this week's guest.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Dr. Mark Yarhouse joins me for this insightful episode. As a clinical psychologist, Mark has devoted his life to researching and assisting people as they navigate the complex relationship between their sexual or gender identity and Christian faith. He leads the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton College, where he also serves as a professor and the chair in psychology. In addition, Mark is currently the chair of the task force on LGBT issues for Division 36 of the American Psychological Association. He's written extensively on topics of gender identity and faith, including his latest book, Emerging Gender Identities. On this episode, Mark and I discuss gender dysphoria and the rise in young people identifying as transgender. Mark shares practical insights on how we, as pastors and ministry leaders, can better approach ministering with those who struggle with sexual identity with both compassion and conviction. Mark also provides 3 different lenses that we can consider as we look at gender identity. It's such a helpful conversation. You'll want to share this with your ministry team and your colleagues. So please now won't you join me in my conversation with Dr. Mark Yarhouse. Mark, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. So glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Jason. I'm glad I could be here and have this conversation together.
Yeah, it's a much needed and very important conversation, Mark. You have really invested your career as a clinical psychologist researching, better understanding, and assisting people as they navigate this complex relationship between their sexual or their gender identity and the Christian faith. Now, gender dysphoria, as we know, is a complex issue. It's an issue that not everyone fully understands. So to begin, Mark, can you help us? What do we really know and what do we not know about where gender dysphoria comes from?
Yeah, so let me just explain a little bit about what it is. So gender dysphoria is the experience of distress that can be associated with a lack of congruence between a person's biological sex and their gender identity. So biological sex is usually through different markers like the chromosomes, gonads, or and then like genitalia, and then those markers and that kind of biological presentation can sometimes be discordant with a gender identity or how a person experiences themselves as like a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. And if that's distressing to them, we call it gender dysphoria. So a negative, difficult emotional state versus like euphoria, right, would be a positive emotional state. Mm-hmm. And so you asked a really interesting question, like, what do we know about how people get there? Like, how does that even come about? And the short answer is we don't know how it comes about or why some people experience this. I would say the most common theory that a lot of people who specialize in this area, the way they tend to think of it is related to what's called brain sex theory, which is it's a theory of differences in just development that that as a fetus is exposed to testosterone, their genitalia will differentiate and go in a male direction. And then later in fetal development, the brain is thought to map in a male direction. And so one thought is it possible that at that point of development, that just doesn't map and they don't go in the corresponding direction for some reason? But that's a theory, and you always have to distinguish theory from research that supports it. So the research there is pretty mixed, I would say. I'm not against it. I'm not critical of the theory, but I think you'd need a lot more research to really land on that being what's going on. There's a couple other theories that are more have to do with more environmental experiences, like growing up, like distance from your, lack of kind of emotional connection, identification with the same gender parent, or like trauma history or things like that. Even parents wishing that they had a child of one sex and they had a child of the other sex has been correlated with gender dysphoria in large studies. So, but when I say that, I'm just saying that there's been a relationship between the two. It doesn't mean it causes it. It just means it's a complicated phenomenon that we don't really know what causes it. So that's really the final answer for today.
Yeah. And Mark, so why is there maybe any explanation for why so many young people are now identifying as transgender? We see this a lot, in our current culture. Is there an explanation for why that's happening?
Well, I would say there's two prominent competing explanations. There is a remarkable uptick in presentations at specialty clinics in the United States, in the UK, in the Netherlands. Other countries have reported this. And so even in the last 5 years, a really dramatic uptick. So I would say the two prominent theories, one is a self-awareness theory, meaning these kids were always there, they were always this way, but there's now greater social acceptance for it, there's language for it, and so people are kind of drawn towards this understanding of who they already are. I think many people in my field are drawn to that explanation. I think it does account for a percentage of this increase. It's hard to know how much, but I think it's a little naive to say that that's all that's going on. Something else is probably going on than just people kind of have the social acceptance to recognize something that's a part of their kind of true self. I would say that I've definitely met with people in their 50s or older who would have appreciated growing up today because they would not have had all the questions that they had. They wouldn't. I remember one person I met was scouring like a medical library to figure out what was going on with them. They thought they were schizophrenic because they just didn't understand what was going on in this experience of their gender. But that was a different generation. And so you're not going to see that today with a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, because the language of being transgender is so prominent and widespread that they're not going to have that same level of questioning. So that's one theory. Self-awareness theory probably explains some of the percentage increase, but I think it's naive to say it explains all of it. The other theory that kind of contrasts with that is sometimes referred to as a social contagion theory. And this is the idea that being transgender is more like a virus that people catch within their peer group, and it becomes this where a young person who's vulnerable to other things, they have other things going on, maybe a background with other traumatic events or other experiences, other co-occurring mental health concerns. They're searching for a sense of identity and a sense of community, a sense of healing, and they find it in this space, and it's kind of caught within peer groups. I don't tend to use that language. I think it's a bit antagonistic to reduce this to kind of like a virus or to call it social contagion. But there's been some one study that was done to kind of look at this. It was a controversial study by Lisa Littman just a couple years ago. And she didn't study the teenagers that she was concerned about. She studied the parents who were concerned that their kids were sort of wrapped up in this identity. And I give her credit for trying to study this phenomenon. We all know something like this is going on. Just the numbers are showing us something's going on. But the question is, what's causing it? Mm-hmm. And I think she raised an interesting question. I think I wish the study had been done a little bit better in terms of its design. But I do give her credit for trying to study it. And I'd love to see more research done to try to answer the very question you're asking me today.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Mark. From your work at the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute, what would you say are the biggest needs related to sexuality and gender identity that you are seeing in the church right now?
Well, I do think the church is at its best when it can do a couple things simultaneously. I do think having a theology of sexuality and gender that is well thought out and anchored in Scripture and is able to sort of help frame and sort of lay a foundation maybe for how the church responds to different things. I think you do need sort of a biblical starting point and a firm sort of scriptural foundation for the church. But then I think you also are going to need a sort of winsome way of presenting that to a culture that is pretty skeptical of the church and sees the church as fairly hypocritical and fairly ineffective. And so what Richard Mao, former president at Fuller Theological Seminary, referred to as convicted civility. He would say that you have far too many Christians who are strong on convictions, but they're not people you'd want to represent the faith to the broader culture because they're just not kind in the way that they interact around other people. But then you have Christians who are so strong on civility, you have no idea what they believe in. So you need Christians with convicted civility. And I would just add to that convicted civility seasoned with compassion for the people who are navigating these questions around gender and sexuality. If you don't have a heart for people, it's going to be very hard for you, I think, to really be a part of their journey.
So how does a church, how does a pastor or ministry leader listening in now, how would they help embrace a biblical understanding of sexuality that is compassionate, but also has true convictions in regard to what we learn from Scripture, what we learn from living as Christ followers? Because I think that's the great challenge, Mark, as I kind of look out across the church landscape, is you have very differing opinions across the church, and everyone feels that their interpretation, their understanding is biblical, right? So how do you kind of formulate that as a pastor, as a ministry leader, and as a church?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you do it individually. I mean, I think there's a Christian tradition. There's a number of scholars who've contributed to our understanding of theology in these areas. So I think you'd sort of look at your sort of Christian heritage around theological claims, theological anthropology, sexual ethics, and really have, I think what many Christians, the average Christian in the pew, may tell you what they believe, but they don't know why they believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. So you want pastors who have done that homework and can tell you not only what they believe or what their church's position is or the doctrinal understanding of this, but they've got it sort of anchored in theological anthropology, a coherent sexual ethic, implications for different topics that we're covering today. But I don't know that a single pastor should sort of think of themselves as a lone ranger who has to rethink the whole thing all over again. I think there's a sense in which the faith is handed on to us and handed to us. And there's a global Christian witness in this area. There's a historical Christian witness in these areas. So I think being able to sort of locate yourself as a pastor within the tradition that you're a part of would be a starting point. But then how are you conversant with the broader culture, which is very diverse? There's great pluralism within our culture and our society. How do you engage with others who disagree with you in a winsome manner, with that convicted civility, seasoned with compassion? I think that's often the thing that's missing. It's not that pastors don't know what they believe about certain things. They're reading, they're trying to stay up on things, they're engaging with people in other fields like me in psychology, other places, learning a little bit more about how science might inform some of the discussion. It shouldn't run the show, but it informs it. We're in a discussion about that, dialoguing about these things, and then being able to sort of guide their congregation around these very, complex issues, but in a nuanced way. And then when you get to pastoral care, then you're applying some of these considerations that you've thought through into pastoral care, which there I think it is more on a case-by-case basis. How do I walk with this person? There is a true north because I've been doing my theological work, but I walk with this person as they're sorting out issues around sexuality and gender. And I'm going to walk with them more on a case-by-case basis rather than give them 5 principles that you should apply to your life. No, I'm going to walk with you and minister to you as you navigate these issues.
Yeah, Mark, that's so good. It's very, very helpful. What are some, as we're looking at this, what are some of the common misconceptions and pitfalls that you've observed that Christ followers fall into, whether pastors, ministers, or even just, Christ followers, parents, or, friends? What are some of those misconceptions that as they're engaging people in their everyday lives who are struggling with gender identity that they often kind of cling to?
Yeah, let me add one thing to what I was saying, and this will bridge us into sort of what are the pitfalls. But I think there's lenses through which people see this topic, and I write about this a little bit in a book called Understanding Gender Dysphoria. But the 3 lenses are an integrity lens, a disability lens, and a diversity lens. And the integrity lens focuses more on the creation stories and God's original creational intent, and the idea that there's an integrity to male-female differences that God intended at creation, and it's the bringing together of those differences in the covenant of marriage that lays the parameters for what's morally permissible sexual behavior, but it also speaks to the concern about adopting a cross-gender identity that would go against that original integrity of differences by male-female differences. And I explain that a little bit more in that book and sort of anchor it in a evangelical theologian who writes a bit about that. But then the disability lens is a lens that says, well, the gender pieces here are probably better explained as variations that occur in nature. But if you're a Christian drawn to that explanation, you would say, well, why do those variations occur? And probably you'd say it's because of the fall. So this group of people is drawn a little bit more to Genesis 3 and the story of the fall and how the fall touches all of creation, including our sexuality and gender. So that this group of people would see it a little bit more like hearing loss. Like hearing loss is, the hearing is not functioning as it was intended, but it's not imbued with moral significance. It's not something you would see as kind of a willful disobedience or sin on the part of the person. It's a variation that occurs in a fallen world. And so how do we respond to this with compassion? The third lens is a lens of diversity. And this is where the broader culture has rapidly moved towards seeing diverse, gender presentations as a celebration of diversity, as an emerging culture, as part of the broader LGBTQ community. And so one thing I think that pastors can do and people in the church can do is kind of locate themselves in relation to these lenses. And I actually argue to think a little bit more about drawing on the best of each of the lenses rather than picking one to the exclusion of the other. I think a biblically faithful starting point begins with that integrity lens. I love the compassion that comes out of the disability lens. And what I think that the diversity lens brings is it tries to address questions around identity and community that are going to be important to the person you're ministering to. So I think that's a piece that I'd want pastors to be aware of. I might not agree with the answers that come out of the diversity lens, but I have to at least acknowledge they're addressing issues of identity and community in ways that resonate with a number of people. So what are some of the misconceptions? One of the misconceptions is tied to the different lenses. Like, one of the misconceptions is that this is just willful disobedience. And that tends to come out of the integrity lens, that somehow a person's making bad decisions and that gets them to this place of gender dysphoria, and they just have to make better decisions. So it's kind of like in John 9, right? The disciples come across the man born blind, and they say, who sinned that this person is blind? Did this man sin or his parents?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes Christians in leadership can approach this issue the same way. Does this person sin that they have gender dysphoria, or did their parents cause this in this person? And I think that's not a good starting point in these conversations. I haven't met anybody who chose to experience gender dysphoria. This is something the person finds themselves struggling with, and they are looking for ways to, respond to that. But to call it willful disobedience, I think, would be a mistake. So that's one misconception, but it's tied especially to that one lens.
So as you're kind of processing through, I think those lenses are very, very helpful, Mark. So as you're kind of thinking through those lenses and kind of processing that, when it comes to practically engaging with people and listening to their stories, but then also helping them, we're called to be disciple makers. So how do you journey with a person in their story, help them find their story in God's greater story? What are some helpful things that as your kind of life on life with people who are struggling with gender dysphoria, that we can do that would help point them to wholeness and healing in their life through Christ, but in a way that's compassionate? What are some of those things that you see Christ followers, pastors, ministry leaders, just friends doing that is most helpful?
So one thing to think about is whether the path forward in ministry is going to be to restore creational intent, or whether it's going to be to foster Christ likeness with an enduring condition. And that probably goes back to the lenses a little bit. Sometimes adherents of solely the integrity lens tend to think that the best move forward in ministry and that is healing, and they define healing as a kind of restoration of God's creational intent. And I don't know that happens too often in this space. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I mean, I believe in a God who can do miraculous things, but I do think that most people experience this as more of a enduring reality, more of a besetting condition. And so I think that more the disability lens tends to see it as, how can God be present in someone's condition, someone's life, and how can someone grow in Christ likeness with something that may not itself be healed this side of eternity? So it has so that's something to think about. That's more of a ministry perspective that probably reflects a little bit of your theology. So something to think about. I would say most people, let me say it this way. Think about your area of ministry as a pastor or a ministry leader in another way. Is your primary area, I think there's three types of areas of ministry. There's people who, for this issue, it's a political identity. These are activists who are pushing back against your beliefs and your convictions. For other people, this is more of a public identity. It's not a political identity, it's a public identity. These are your neighbors. These are your coworkers. These are the people bagging your groceries. These are the people delivering your pizza. This is just kind of trying to do life, and they live next door to you. For other people, this is their private identity. They are struggling with this, and they're asking for ministry and for counsel. So one thing I encourage people in ministry to think about is, what's your primary area of ministry? What are you called to? Most of us are not called to debate and engage with political activists. But if you are, it takes a different sort of skill set to navigate those debates at that level. Most of us are called to minister in what I would call that public identity, your neighbor, a extended family member, something like that. But we do this so well in so many other areas. If someone's agnostic, they're atheist, they're from a different religious background, it's like we tend to rise to the occasion. We engage with them. We talk with them. We recognize that we see things differently. Well, if you think of it that way, someone navigating gender identity has an individual characteristic that's different than your own. But think of it like any other individual characteristic that you're pretty good at relating to, and try to use the same skill set there. Like relate to them, ask them about their hopes and what life's been like for them. I remember one pastor called me and said that a person was asking, "Hey, could I come to your church?" And they were struggling with some of these issues. They identified as transgender, and the pastor hung up and they called me and said, "What should I do? I don't have no." And I was never trained in this in seminary. We didn't cover this. And I said, "Well, call them back and take them out for coffee. And when you sit down with them, tell them this: I feel like I'm meeting you at about chapter 7 of your life, but I haven't had a chance to hear about chapters 1 through 6, but I'd like to." Like, minister
Right.
to them
Right.
as you would anybody else who's just different from you on these different individual characteristics. So show compassion, show interest. Don't make who they are all about their gender. But of course, it's important to them. So let them talk about that, but let them talk about other things, where they work, other dreams they have for their life, what they're hoping to accomplish, things like that. Um, and then if it's the private identity piece, the person who's actually asking for counsel, and you're going to minister to them because it's a conflict, their gender is a conflict for them, and they're trying to figure this out. You've got to avoid little sound bites and memes that people do all the time in ministry, not just for this issue, but for grief and trauma and other things. People often say things like, I remember one woman who came to us who suffered from this. She brought this to her pastor, and he had said to her, "You need to pick up your cross and follow Christ." And she said, she looked at me and she said, "I don't even know what that means for me." And then she said, "I don't even think my pastor knows what it means." But it was a sound bite that sometimes we give to people in the moment of counseling. And it kind of discharges our sense of responsibility to walk with them by telling them something that is sort of sounds right, like pick up your cross, but we don't actually unpack what that would look like for this person and promise to walk with them in that journey. I mean, ministry to this group of people is a sustained presence, sustained over time, a ministry presence sustained over time, asking really tough questions, facing really tough questions together, not so much putting them on the spot, but unpacking some of the questions that they're struggling. They want to know, what does God think of me? They want to know, what would God have for me? Those are the questions that they're asking as well. And so to be able to unpack that with them would be a great gift you could give.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent, Mark. Mark, there are passages in the New Testament, and some people wrestle with these passages that seem to share that we shouldn't fellowship with people who are claiming to be followers of Jesus but are living in sin. Right. So a classic example, 1 Corinthians 5:11-13 says, "But now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, slanderer, drunkard, swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside, but to expel the wicked person from among you," right? And so sometimes people latch on to these passages. What would you say to those who are following Jesus who believe that this passage is prohibiting them from fellowshipping with someone who claims to be a believer and is, for example, possibly pursuing transitioning or wrestling with this?
Okay, wow, there's a lot in that question. So let me try to unpack this on a couple of different levels. So one is, I think if a church is going to start to identify things that preclude them from fellowshipping with people, they're going to have to be very thoughtful about being consistent here around what they're saying, because there's a lot of things that get a pass in the local church, a lot of things that people struggle with: greed and pride and idolatry of like money and prestige and power. There's been a lot of cases of more high profile leaders in churches who are predatory in their behavior. Like there's a lot of things that I think people in the communities that we're talking about would point to and say, you got to clean up your own house before you start singling us out. And I resonate with that. I think we have to be pretty consistent across the board if we're going to start talking about singling out people who are like navigating gender identity questions. Now, if you say to me, okay, let's take that to be a fair point, and we should do better at not coming across like we're singling out this group of people. We want to do this across the board. Start with me. I get that. Like, I think that's the place I would begin. Now, most churches do some of what you're describing through a process of like membership. Like if you're visiting our church, or we've been missional, we've been reaching out to your community, and now we're inviting you to sort of taste and see what our church would be like, and you're thinking about joining, there's a point at which people tend to decide, will I sit under the spiritual authority of this church? And that's usually the point of membership. And I think that is a very important point to let people know what your expectations are for what it means for a Christian to live a life under Christ as your Lord as well as your Savior. And then what are the implications for the things that we're talking about here? And so that's something I think kind of happens a bit through the way churches are developed in our culture right now. Now, the other thing to think about is, you mentioned transitioning. So that comes back to your lens. Is transitioning sinful? And that's going to be answered differently based on the lens through which you see this issue. Do you see it as a moral issue? Transitioning is quite broad here. So transitioning can mean socially, no medical interventions whatsoever. I've known people who, like a biological female who just keeps her hair short, and she tends to wear more androgynous attire that's not necessarily from the women's section of the store, but it's comfortable for her and it helps her manage her dysphoria. So that's not really a transition, but that's maybe a partial like management of the dysphoria. Other people, like I know a natal male who keeps his hair longer, he wears light makeup, it sort of helps take the edge off the dysphoria. Like, is that sinful to do that, is a question I think we're going to be grappling with. I'd ask pastors to grapple with. And maybe they feel like it's easier when you get to questions of like surgical procedures or cross-gender hormonal treatment or things like that. But most people don't do surgeries. Only about 25, I think, % of people in the last national transgender survey were using any kind of medical intervention like surgery. Fewer than half were using hormonal treatment. So most people do other things. And so what exactly here are we going to land on that says this would be sinful to do? And other lenses would see these as kind of like interventions that you do, medical or non-medical, to sort of manage a besetting condition that the person's not able to find relief through other strategies. So I think those are things that I still grapple with. I'd invite pastors to grapple with. I don't think there are easy answers to that. There's not a lot of scripture that speaks to that, although there are passages that do talk about some kind of cross-dress presentation. Usually it's associated with pagan practices of the Canaanites, but that also engaged in same-sex behavior. So it's a little bit complicated when you start to get into that. And that's what I would ask for pastors and theologians to help guide the church in thinking that through, both theologically and then in terms of pastoral care.
Yeah, that's good, Mark. Now, from your perspective, we've talked a lot about how pastors, ministry leaders can kind of engage, minister, pastoral care, these conversations, all very, very helpful advice, Mark. Very appreciative of that. But when it comes to a pastor, one of their big roles is oftentimes, preaching, right? They're in the pulpit, they're on the platform and they're preaching. What advice do you have for pastors when it comes to, LGBTQ issues? Like, what arena is the best place for them to engage in these? Is it ever helpful, beneficial, appropriate to address these, in a sermon? or where do you see those pastors and ministry leaders who be most effective, really approaching these types of topics?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I think most effective is probably one-on-one and like Christian education classes and small groups. Like I could imagine leading a cell group or a home group where you sort of invite people from the LGBTQ community to participate, to study God's word, to pray for one another, things like that. I think those are more effective ministry approaches, but it doesn't mean you couldn't do a sermon. I mean, I've seen very good sermon series more on sexuality broadly. And so there's a lot of things being covered. And this is not left out, I think focusing on it narrowly or exclusively would be a little bit more of a risk and probably not as helpful. Singling this out, I think, would be how that would come across. But if you cover a lot of territory, I wouldn't leave this out. But keep in mind that whenever you do a sermon, it's kind of like when I teach as a professor, it's a little more top down, a little more power based, because I'm the person kind of teaching or you're the person preaching. It will come across to the person in the pew as a little more top down. And that doesn't mean that you don't do it, but realize how that's experienced. So what I try to do is make more emotional connections with the people in my audience, or a pastor could think about this with their congregation. So I tend to include quotes from things that I've done or passages that I'm reading that sort of help the person in the pew see themselves. So I always imagine that there are students who are navigating these issues in my class. If I preach, I would imagine that there's people in my pews navigating these issues. You preach differently when you start to think of people that you're talking about a concept, but there's people in the pew and this is their story. That helps you make more of an emotional connection. How would you frame things knowing that in the third pew back, this person's grappling with these very questions in their life, or this is a parent whose loved one just shared with them that they're transgender at 16, right? And so would you preach differently? I think you'd try to make more emotional connections. You'd want your church to be a spiritually and emotionally safe place for people to be able to ask tough questions about this, and to not feel like if they ask questions, they're going to get kind of a hammer but no, they're going to be welcome to ask those questions. I'll ask those questions with you. I'll take the time to unpack the answers to those questions. I'll acknowledge where there's areas that we're still kind of grappling with that, either from science or just understanding what God would have us say to this specific, question that you're asking. I think those are fair things to do that make this come alive for people in a little more of an emotionally compelling way. I think those are some things that I've seen help. So yes, you can preach on it, but think about some of those principles. The more effective is probably in smaller groups where people can talk a little bit about what questions they have, some of the struggles they've had in their family, ways in which they've been navigating this when they came out to their parents and what that was like for them. Those are the kinds of stories that I think a church should be a safe place to tell.
Yeah, that's good, and it's that idea of remembering that sensitivity, that compassion, right? That Christ embodied, and how do we talk about topics such as this, keeping that in mind. So I think that's super helpful. Mark, as we wind down this conversation, it's been absolutely excellent. I think very, very helpful. You have written extensively, obviously. You've invested your life's work into these exact topics. What resources would you recommend pastors, youth leaders, maybe parents, looking into if they have someone in their life, or if they know that they're going to be, in ministry more than likely and in contact with people who are wrestling with gender dysphoria or gender identity issues?
Yeah, let me mention two. I mentioned earlier the book that I wrote called Understanding Gender Dysphoria, but I have a new book that came out in August called Emerging Gender Identities, and it sort of updates everybody on what's happened even in the last 5 years. What are some of the controversies in the field that I'm in? Where are the debates occurring, hallway conversations? And then the second half of the book is on ministry postures, and I think that might be helpful for some folks. Another book is Preston Sprinkle just published a book called Embodied, and he's a theologian. So he does grapple with some of the science and tries to kind of update the reader on sort of where the science is. And I think he does a nice job with that. And I think it's also especially good on asking more of the theological questions that I think pastors would grapple with, where, I'm a psychologist who spoke to some of that through those lenses and things like that. But I think Preston does a nice job complementing some of that in my work as a theologian in helping Christians think through some of the theological questions that arise from both science and experience. And he's a very kind of winsome writer who engages with the community, similar, I think, to how we've been trying to talk about this today. So not so much the culture war posture, but more what does it mean to articulate a Christian conviction in a diverse and pluralistic culture, but do so in a winsome manner. So I think those two books might be helpful to people listening to this podcast.
Excellent. Mark, thank you so much again for making the time to be with us. Thank you for all that you do as you invest your time, your energy, and your expertise, continuing to learn, to grow, and then help us understand what you guys are discovering and uncovering so that we can better navigate these with our friends, relatives, our neighbors and coworkers, and really just live out the mission that God's called us to live. So appreciate all the work that you're doing. All the work that your colleagues are doing as well. I mean, as you're, providing these resources, the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute there at Wheaton, we just so appreciate all of that. So thank you for making time to be with us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Jason. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and to your audience.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. God bless you.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Church Leaders Podcast. Be sure to check out the other episodes in this series. You don't want to miss out on the full discussion. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of our interviews. We'd appreciate it if you could take just a few moments to let us know your thoughts by leaving us a review on your preferred podcast platform or sending an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com. Your positive reviews and ratings help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.